Welcome to a further GUI-XT video tutorial. Today's goal is to integrate customized columns displaying your data into an existing SAP table control. Our example begins with a transaction found in the purchasing category, namely MEO3. The source list displays which suppliers or vendors have a given material available in a specified time frame. At the moment, only the vendor number is displayed, without the associated vendor name. Using menu, the user can find both the name and address of a given vendor. But this is somewhat cumbersome. It would be more convenient to add a column to the table control that displays the vendor names. Here is a sketch of what we would like to achieve. We want to insert two columns to the right of vendor number for name and location. So how can we go about making these changes? We begin by going into GUI-XT Script Editor Pro, displaying the current script, which is still empty, and creating two new columns with the column command. We specify the title of the column, for example, name, and also the name of the GUI-XT variable pertaining to this column. In this case, vendor name. Then we set a column width with the size equals statement and use the position option to indicate where the column is to be inserted. Let's have a look where we want the new column, in position 4. Then the new column should appear to the right of vendor number. We set the column to read only to prevent the user from entering data. In theory, having an input column is possible, but that is not something we need at this point. After activating the script, we have a newly created and empty column for vendor name. We then copy the code and make the appropriate changes for the location column. The name is city, the GUI-XT variable vendor city, and the position 5 to the right of the vendor name. After activation, we can now see the second new column labeled city. In order to test our code, let's enter a fixed value into the first row of the name column. The GUI-XT variable is called vendor name, then .1 for row 1. This is the absolute row number, and ABC Inc. as our test name. Activate script, and we see that the name is correctly displayed. So far, so good. But of course, we don't want to display a constant value, but rather the name of the respective vendor. For that, we first get rid of our test and make sure there's nothing left in the columns from the previous transaction call by using the clear command for both name and location. Now both columns are empty. To automatically display the data, we need to set up a loop that goes through the rows of the table and reads in the supplier name and location. As per usual, we define a counter, in this case I, that starts with row 1. However, we also need a variable that represents the absolute row number. This is important because the user can scroll down in the table and the row at the top of the screen may sometimes not correspond to the absolute row number. So we have two variables named I and K respectively. and must first calculate the scroll position of the table. This information can be accessed using the getTableAttribute statement. As always, full documentation is available by pressing F1. We need first visible row, in other words, the number of the first row that is displayed. We can also select first visible row in the editor via the keyword options and pass this value to the variable k. So I is the row number displayed on the screen, and k is the absolute row number within the table. Now to the actual loop that provides the data for the column variables for all displayed rows. The basic loop structure begins with a label at the top, for example, next row. Then we write the code to increase our counters I and also k by 1. And then send the loop back up to the label next row. The loop as it stands would continue to run indefinitely. Thus, we need to insert a conditional statement. For this, we set a new GUI-XT variable vendor no to equal the vendor number of the current line. This can be done easily in Script Editor. Here we read in the technical table column name LIFNR, but the actual column name could also be used, not forgetting the row number. Now we use a query to determine whether there is a vendor number, and if so, we read the name and location, and finish when all occupied rows have been processed. This is where the reading in will take place, but in order to test the loop, let's just enter vendor number itself. Save, syntax check, and activate script. It only worked in the first row of the table. Oh, there's an error message. We need to name the table. So T, square bracket open, table, square bracket close, because there could be multiple tables on the screen. Activate. Now it looks good. All rows are processed, and we have essentially duplicated the vendor number column. That means we can take out the test and instead read in the name and address of the vendors via a SAP BAPI call. First, we have to choose a suitable BAPI, for example, via transaction SE37, function builder. Then browse the BAPIs by searching with BAPI _ vendor _ There are a lot of options. Get detail will work for us as it exists in most application objects. Press display, then import to show the import parameters. Here we find the vendor number. Under export, we go to general detail where we find name and city. Let's now test the function block. Enter the vendor number and then F8 for execute. The output includes the name and, further to the right, the location. We are now ready to code the script in the editor by first inserting the BAPI name underscore get detail, exporting the parameter vendor no, and importing the structure called general detail, which we define as BAPI vendor info. Above, we use the GUI-XT statement create structure with the name BAPI vendor info and a list of the fields we require. In this case, name and city. The GUI-XT call interface will then only transport these two fields. Now we can fill our columns with values by entering BAPI vendor info into line 29 of our example, followed by .name, and duplicating the command and adjusting for city. Comments are always useful. Let's test the code. Syntax check, activate script. Good. The columns name and city have been filled. In the last few minutes, let's turn our attention to a more technical issue. In particular, we want to have a look at how long our RFC accesses are taking. To do this, we go to Options in the GUI-XT window and turn on Rfc Trace. We execute the script anew and find 3 accesses, about 40 milliseconds each. We can optimize this by setting the cache option in the call, namely cache equals session. This means that within a current session, GUI-XT stores the results of calls. When we execute our program again with this session cache, we see that the access times are much reduced, often less than 1 millisecond. Let's execute again and scroll down. When scrolling, only newly appearing vendors result in computational activity. The other rows are read from the cache. Now, let's have a look at transaction MEO1, which uses the same screen as MEO3, but allows vendor number to be changed. Our new name and location columns are displayed. And if we change a vendor number, for example, to 1004, the name is automatically changed to Jones. Let's try another vendor number, and again, name and location are adjusted. We have achieved exactly what we set out to do.